The average Australian, how do they engage in the investment market for residential properties?
You don't have to be an average Aussie. You can pick and choose what type of Aussie you want to be, but the three questions I always bring it down to: what you're actually trying to achieve, over what time frame, versus what your finances allow.
We see a lot of investors buying apartments. Is there a reason why there's so much of that happening?
I typically find that established apartments are much better value than brand new apartments. For me, it's all about the unique characteristics of the property and where it's located and what its propensity to have future growth is going to be.
But what people don't realize with residential, it's a made up price. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. We can kind of equate it to the build cost, but it's just what someone's willing to pay.
Set some goals for yourself and take action to get it, because if you don't take action on the goals, they're just a dream.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Investing for Doctors podcast. I'm your host, Dr. B. Now today we have a panel session. We've got Harvey and Steve Palise with us back again. Briefly, Steve is the owner of Palise Property. He previously had an episode that we talked about on commercial property, so tune into that if you want to know a bit more about him. And Rich is the CEO and founder of Propertybuyer. Again, we had a previous episode with Rich, so tune into that if you want to know a bit more about what Rich does. So today we brought both of you here today to have a little panel discussion on residential investments and focusing on sort of what you look out for in buying a residential investment property. So before we start, how many residential investment properties have you done roughly in your time as a buyer's agent?
Well, for me, we've bought over 4,500 properties for our clients. So we started in 2001. And counting.
Counting. Excellent. And Steve, yourself?
I'm close to 2,000 now.
Yeah.
So Rich is the goat in the industry. He's been going a little bit longer than me. I've been going for 7 years now. So but 2,000. So about 1,200 resis and about 800 commercial now.
Yeah. So you're obviously the sort of more focused on residential investment properties.
I don't touch owner occupied. Like unlike Rich's podcast, I'm an ex-engineer. I hate the emotions of it, and I can't deal with people when they're like, "Oh, I don't like the outdoor living area." I'm just like, "Who cares? It's functional. Let's get on with it." I'm all numbers, no emotions. You can't argue when I give you the data. You might not like it, but you can't argue with it.
You can't argue with the numbers, right? So, residential investment. Give me the lowdown on how you look at them.
Simple thing for me is supply and demand. So you've got to look at what people don't realize with residential, it's a made up price. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. We can kind of equate it to the build cost, but it's just what someone's willing to pay. So you just basically need to have more demand than the actual supply, and then that's what brings it up. And then there's macro drivers for that. So typically we'll look at days on market, livability scores, what infrastructure is going in, population growth. But then the big one for me is affordability. So if it isn't for investing, who's actually buying that? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that suburb when you're talking investing. When it's principal place of residence that Rich spoke about on the last podcast, that's obviously got to do with how much the people living there can afford. This one's how much the investors can afford. And then kind of correlating that to, okay, how much room has this got to grow? And then go from there. No one can predict within 6-12 months what it's going to do.
And how much the renters are going to pay as well, isn't it?
Exactly right. That's affordability. So that moves into it as well. So, and they're the kind of growth ones. And then we can go into the microeconomics of the area and things like that. But they're my key ones is days on market, supply and demand, affordability, and then basically servicing, which comes from the affordability.
Rich, what's your approach to that?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, I guess if you really want to, people love little acronyms and takeaways. So for me, it's as simple as PIE. Population growth, infrastructure, and employment opportunities. I mean, there's just the top 3 levels, and I've got 20 or 25 or more, just like you would have, Steve. But I just unpack that. So what I'm looking for, if I'm going to buy in an area, I want to know there's consistent population growth. I don't want to buy in areas where there's population decline. Because as Steve said, it is all about supply and demand. Property is a derived demand. It's derived from how much people want to live there and what the underlying supply of dwellings are in that fact, and that determines price. So you've got willingness to pay and willingness to accept on both sides of a property transaction, and that determines price. So population, I want it to be increasing. However, there are exceptions to that rule, and I'll just give you one example. A good example is Southwest Sydney. So Southwest Sydney is projected to be the biggest population growth, but it won't necessarily have the biggest price increase because there's going to be lots of supply coming online in those areas, like Luddenham, and all those areas around the airport. So just be careful. Don't always just pick one criteria and go, that's a good investment area because the population is increasing. It's just one factor.
It's all supply and demand.
Especially in those like high density areas, it's very easy to oversupply it as well when they're doing high density stuff. And that's one of the misconceptions. Like regional areas don't grow. They don't have the same population growth, but they can necessarily have actually better demand because there's less stock as well.
Exactly.
So like Rich said, it's getting those two aligned.
It's getting them aligned. So second one will be infrastructure. So I love infrastructure as a precursor to property price growth. So things like train lines.
The metro.
Yeah, the metro. I mean, that's a game changer. You know, new roads, new hospitals, particularly hospitals that attracts great doctors and staff that want to potentially live in that area, you know. So all of that infrastructure, schools, you know, that's a really big driver. Airports, all that sort of thing is a really big driver for property prices. Olympics, you know, it's not the only thing, but it certainly helps because there's construction. There's two parts to infrastructure. One is when they announce it, you'll see a little bit of a spike in growth. And then after it's completed, when the amenity of whatever that infrastructure is has gone up. So one example would be years ago, the M2, right? When the M2 opened up, property prices in Baulkham Hills went up 30% the following year.
But for those that don't live in Sydney, where does the M2?
Northwest Sydney. So Northwest Sydney.
I live in Sydney, I don't even know where the M2
So the M2
I've got a property there.
The M2 knocked 15 minutes off travel time.
Yeah.
So 15 minutes is a significant amount of time for people that opened up a new area.
Yeah.
So that can happen in other parts of Australia too. And the last one would be employment opportunities. I want to buy in areas where there's good incomes, where there's a diverse range of employment opportunities. I'm not going to invest typically in Longreach or Mount Isa, you know, all these, you know, it really could have particularly one dominating industry in mining towns. For me, that's not a safe risk for me. So I like to buy obviously in the capital cities, the major regionals, and some of the more productive regional areas that I think are going to grow in value where there's limited supply and high demand.
I want to touch on the Olympics because I get asked about that almost every single day in Brisbane, and I've got a bit of a different view on that. So like, what's your view around Olympics? Because for me, people like you get the initial spike because of the excitement, but I saw, like I grew up in Sydney, in Western Sydney, the Sydney 2000 Olympics, the market did basically nothing from 2004 to 2012, but because there was an oversupply. So they built all the infrastructure there. They got the stadiums, Homebush, the high-rise apartments, but then the vacancies shot up as well because as soon as the Olympics finished, it went from there. So I think timing the market, just because it's coming, you'll get that spike, but it doesn't mean you're going to get a nice steady growth over 7 years. It's about, again, supply and demand, looking at the vacancy rates, what people are moving there. But the infrastructure does give the ability for that area to be another metropolitan area.
Yeah, I think just on that point too, I agree that the Olympics is not the only factor. It's certainly the pre-construction of the Olympics is helping to bring a lot of people. The biggest driver for me in Brisbane is the massive interstate migration. We've got 110,000 people a year moving north across the border, and there's just very, very few properties available. So that's the biggest driver. But I guess the last thing I'd say is, like Steve said, you know, all the other metrics, all the micro metrics, you know, we look at days on market, online search interest, ratio of owner-occupier to investor in an area. I like to buy in areas where there's not more than, say, 30% investors and 70% owner occupiers. And the reason I like that is because if I'm putting my property up for rent, it doesn't have to compete with the mass market. It's a much more contained market because owner occupiers will always hold on to their property and typically look after their properties better than what the investor will.
I think having where like a lot of markets shift where they become 70% investor, but that gives it a false floor as well because it's a made up price. As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, what we pay for a property is the demand. So when you've got 70% investors, that can fluctuate because owner occupiers aren't actually living there. It's just people because of lifestyle. So having that demand, it means what I like about that is when it's 70% owner occupier is you've got some trust in the numbers. So all the macro drivers we look at, if owners are affording there, cool, long term you're going to be right. For the next 5-10 years, it's a safe investment.
From an investment perspective, there's obviously different models of investing. There's the buy and hold forever kind of mentality. And there's some people who think, oh yeah, I'll hold on to this for a while and then sell it off. Does that change what you look at?
Not really for me, but I'll look at the type of demographic and age groups moving there as well, because that is also an indicator as well. If you start looking at the age bracket of the people buying there and it's 70-year-olds and that's it, that's not going to have a huge spike over the next 5 years because they're effectively going to pass it on. So you actually want that kind of in between where the growing incomes as well, because the growth of the incomes is going to mean it's more affordable and then it's going to get the growth that way.
To that point, we're talking about aspirational buyers. That's what you really want to buy in areas where the income is good for the purchasers, where the incomes are higher, because typically incomes are also a key determinant of property prices. So if you've got lots of, yuppies and what are we other acronyms that we could use, but all those sort of people are going up the sort of the social ladder in a way. They're the areas you want to buy in because those people are aspirational, will tend to pay more for their properties, want to renovate them and want better quality of living.
But bringing it back, it can also be relative to where you're buying. So like Northern Beaches where we live, again, aspirational, yuppie, a lot of yuppies there, good incomes. You can also look at Western Sydney, like Blacktown, and because the house price is much lower and the investment price is lower, but the incomes relative to it are actually higher. It can actually be more affordable and there actually is sometimes more room to grow. And kind of making that investment decision is actually based on your personal circumstances, like what you can actually afford. So if you can't afford the Northern Beaches, looking in Western Sydney might be an option because it's more affordable. But again, looking at that average house price to average income or the investor income will give you a bit of an indication of what's possible. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it gives you an indication of what's possible.
You make a good point about stigma. I mean, some people think Western Sydney or Ipswich or whatever is like, oh, why would I ever buy there? But forget that. It's all about the numbers, as Steve said. It's all about
emotion.
Funny about the emotion. You've just got to look at, I mean, I do go to State Story. My wife and I recently bought a property up on the Central Coast. Yep. And I got it off market and we went through it. My wife said to me, Rich, we're not buying this property. I said, why not? Oh, it just looks so ugly. Anyway, we ended up buying it and we did a granny flat on it. We're getting a 6.5% yield out of it. You know, it's been great, right? And we did a 30K reno on it. But it was that emotional reaction that just looked really ugly and needed tidying up that kind of created that perception.
Funny you mentioned, so Western Sydney, I've got two properties there. They've both been my best performers. My first property I bought was in Blacktown for 230 grand. So a house for 230 grand that's now worth 650, 700. And this is what, 2012, so what, 10 years? And then another one, I got an Ipswich cafe that I bought for 400 that's now worth 800 over the last 5 years. So there is a stigma. You can still do well in those ones. And they're more positively geared as well, so they're easy to look after themselves.
I think you make another good point, Steve. You're bouncing off each other here. Is just this idea of buying a reasonably affordable property that has the propensity to go up in value. If you go and buy in an area and pay, over the odds for that area, then the capital growth is going to be more restricted compared to buying an area where the right demographics, the right data can then go to more. And that's why you're seeing a lot of investors buying, particularly interstate. They're not necessarily buying. I mean, Sydney's still a great area to invest in, don't get me wrong. But depending on your income and what stage you're at with your investing journey, you need to diversify your portfolio across different states.
Affordability is the key word as well. So affordability doesn't mean cheap. Like you can look on the Northern Beaches and you can go on the census data. So look at the ABS census data and look at average household incomes. The average household income of, say, Freshwater, where I live, I imagine is probably around 200, 250 as a minimum. Whereas if you go, say, Western Sydney, it might be $95,000. But the houses are half the price. So they can both be affordable in those markets. It doesn't necessarily mean cheap.
Correct.
And so getting back to the concept of sort of investment property, and as I mentioned earlier, there are sort of different ways of investing. You've touched on building a granny flat in the back and then renting both out. And there's obviously the ones where you just buy and hold and rent it out forever. And then there's the ones who want to buy and hold and then sell at one stage. What is the general, what is the average Australian? How do they engage in the investment market for residential properties? Is it just a buy and hold and keep it on forever, or do they flip it? Or
one of the points I always make is you don't have to be an average Aussie. Like you can pick and choose what type of Aussie you want to be, but the three questions I always bring it down to: what you're actually trying to achieve, over what time frame, versus what your finances allow. So sometimes your finances are the one that dictate the strategy. But like an example would be, if you're a 63-year-old, buying a negatively geared investment property doesn't really help you. No. So you want to do something creative. You want to buy a little block of apartments, a house and granny flat strategy, something that's going to give you an actual income. If you're 19 years old, it's all about leverage. Leverage up to the eyeballs, use bank guarantees, bank of mum and dad, pay lenders mortgage insurance, get a 95% loan and leverage your money because you've got time on your side. And that's what's going to grow. So it's trying to make that. And then how quickly you want to do something might be whether you build a granny flat or do a development project or reno yourself. One of the key things, a lot of people think they buy a house and they're going to build a granny flat and that's going to be a great option. It's not necessarily if it's at the start of your portfolio, because you're going to spend 200, 300 grand building a granny flat. You don't get the property valued at 300 grand more because you built a 300 grand granny flat. So you've actually lost out on a bit of equity that could have went to the next property. So it's a nice little exit strategy. So if you know you're coming to your serviceability limit and you're not going to be buying for a couple of years, great, fantastic. Or you're retiring, it's an option there. So like all my residential properties, I've sold off a lot of them and transferred into commercial for passive income. I've kept the ones that have granny flat potential because I know I'm going to add the granny flats and that's going to boost my passive income. But again, that's my strategy. I'm all about passive income. I don't really care about growth as much anymore. Yep. And a young investor, it's all about growth and not as important for the cash flow.
Yeah. I think for me, again, as Steve said, it's all about individual strategy. So we sit down with a client and work out, again, based on a factor, a discovery call, look at their income, look at what property holdings they've got, if any, and then work out where do you want to get to? Like, do you want a passive income of 200K? Okay, let's reverse engineer that, work out what property types and locations will achieve that outcome. So for me, I'm much more a believer in buy and hold because, and that's typical. I have traded some properties along the way, not to say you don't sell, but the problem is once you sell, then you're paying transaction costs, you're paying capital gains tax, you've lost your stamp duty that you've got to buy on the next property. So for me,
selling agent costs as well.
Exactly,
like it's 10% costs. Almost.
Exactly. So your changeover cost it just chews up your profit. So for me, I much prefer the concept of leverage and recycling my equity. So if I bought $1 million property, held it for 5 years, and it's gone to 1.5 million, I've got 500 grand of equity I can play with and recycle into maybe 2 or 3 more properties, depending on where my strategy is.
Yeah.
So. Just one point I'd make, Steve, is that with the granny flat thing, I've found on my own personal portfolio that where I've added I just did a 240K granny flat and got it revalued, it's actually gone up more than what I've actually spent on the flat. Yeah. So it's actually, a lot of people say, it's going to be a detriment to land. It's not. The number of people I find that want to buy, not just owner occupiers, but investors want to buy properties with flats has gone up exponentially. So
how have you found that, because that comment mainly came from about 2 or 3 years ago before build costs go up. How have you found that in the last 2 or 3 years with the build costs obviously increasing as well?
It's gone, but the rent's gone up commensurately. That's the problem. I mean, that's the good thing. So the rents on the granny flats, like the one I've got, I actually built a 3-bedroom granny flat, a little bit of a sneaky strategy.
3-bedroom granny flat.
Yeah, that's not really a granny
flat anymore.
It is. It's like another house, but I'm getting $650 a week for that. So, but that's the thing. The rents go up commensurately to cover off the building costs. So
where's that one? Because I've got one in Brisbane I'm doing at the moment. They get about $550 and it's 180 grand to build the granny flat. This is in the Logan area in Eagleby.
Yeah, good one. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So now this is a topic that gets debated a lot. Apartments, townhouses, house with land. Is there a no-go, or is everything about your individual circumstance?
I'll say there's not a one-size-fits-all. So you can invest in apartments, you can invest in townhouses, you can invest in houses and do well with all of those. It just depends where they're located. I think if we go back probably to a first part of our discussion around the property criteria. So we look firstly at the location for our client. What is the location that's going to deliver the outcome? Then we look at the property type, and then we look at the individual property features. A lot of people go the other way around. They look at the carpet and go, that's nice, or that's a nice curtain. Not where is this actually property physically located. But to your question on property type, I tend to go and favour houses because it's the land content typically has driven. I've done the analysis over 30, 40 years on all the median house prices in all the capital cities and regional areas. We've found that houses tend to outperform apartments by about 2%. So over the last 25 years, I did the analysis from 2003 to 2023 recently. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, average yearly capital gain was between 7.5 to 7.9%. For units, it was around 5.5%. So there's a 2% differential in buying apartments. Having said that, going forward from now, there's this issue of affordability. So we're buying actually some really good quality apartments in Melbourne, which are literally almost below replacement cost at the moment. So, so actually finding, boutique blocks of like 4 or 6 apartments in good areas, close to good infrastructure, you can, if you're on a lower budget, you can buy an apartment and do quite well and get a great return. So it comes down to the individual's budget and their long-term criteria.
And the individual micro.
I think you made a good point. That's what I was going to say. I don't touch high density apartments because I don't like the idea, whether or not they're going to have some growth out of it or not, of paying a lot of money for a bit of concrete in the sky, because sky's infinite. So they can keep building up. It's too easy to oversupply if you've got a high density apartment. But what I tell my clients, if you can't afford a house or a townhouse, a little block of 4, you still have a significant land component. You still theoretically own 1/4 of that land, which is where the growth comes from. But to answer your question, I won't pay for the pay what you can afford, like Rich said. So like I've bought 3 or 4 townhouses over my career as well. They've still done really well. They've still doubled in price. But that's because at the time I didn't have a spare 600, 700 grand to buy a house. I bought one in Foster for $112,000 and I rented for $280 a week. So Foster's like 3 hours north of Sydney. And I sold that, 4 years later for $250. So you can still do well on those little ones, but that's because I was a poor uni student. I couldn't actually afford anything else. So you're tied up with it, but fundamentally owning land is the most important thing. It's where they're not making any more of it, and there's been wars over it for thousands of years. Like that's where I want to put my money, and why I like property over shares and other things.
I think another example, I bought a property in Melbourne maybe 15 years ago. I paid, what's the number, 510,000 for a 3-bedroom townhouse in Carlton. It's now worth about 1.6, and it's got a great view of the city, 3 bedrooms, 3 levels, lock-up garage, study nook. It's fantastic. And I rent it for $12.50 a week.
Townhouses, you still have the land component. That's what people, for some reason, they kind of bundle it in with apartments. You still got that. The only thing is you've got a restriction of what you can do with it. You can't knock it down and build a 3-story one, for instance.
Yeah.
You're kind of limited to renovations on the inside. Whereas a house, it's the same thing, land component, but renovations on the outside and more value add development potential and things like that, and granny flats, etc.
Yeah. I mean, we see a lot of investors buying apartments. Is there a reason why there's so much of that happening?
Because the property spookers have got in there, mate.
I think that's a lot for the plan ones.
Well, I just say, this is again the general caution. I'd say to a lot of investors, doctors out there, just avoid off the plan property spooker type properties, because as Steve said, you're buying space in the air. Even though in Melbourne, for example, at the moment they're saying it's 0 stamp duty, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good investment just because you're paying no stamp duty on that investment. So be very careful what you buy. I typically find that established apartments are much better value than brand new apartments. Yes, you get the tax depreciation on them, but at the end of the day, it's like buying a brand new car. As soon as you drive out of the showroom, what's it worth? 10, 20% less, right?
Yeah.
So, for me, it's all about the unique characteristics of the property and where it's located and what its propensity to have future growth is going to be.
I think there's 2 aspects to it. I find for the client base that have bought them, and I don't buy apartments, by the way, they either bought the off the plan because they've been sold to like, oh, great depreciation, it's brand new. But like you said, as soon as you drive it off the floor, it's the thing. Because I've been offered before $85,000 to push an apartment in Brisbane. And I obviously don't do that. Like we get paid for service. So if I'm getting paid that, like how much are you overpaying? The builder's got his margin, the real estate agent's got their margin, but I don't touch those. The other aspect I find is when people want to buy in their hometown. So a lot of like my Sydney clients, they can't afford a house in the area they live, and they go, oh, the houses where I live are 2.5 mil, but apartment's only 900,000. I'll get the apartment, but that's because they're not borderless. They're just looking in their own backyard and they go, oh, I know the area, I know where the train station is, the bus stop.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with capital growth.
Yeah.
The apartment does not care that you know where the bus stop is.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a way, there's a lot of people who invest, but there's ulterior gains to at the end, which may not be just dollar and cents.
Correct.
Because we have family, we have kids, we have retirement plans and that sort of thing. And do you see some people, for myself, I bought some apartments near the university, so when my kids get old, they can go live in it.
Yep.
Right?
So you've got a mixed objective there. So right? That's what I'm saying. So when we're talking to a client, that's where we get really ultra clear on strategy. Is this a lifestyle decision? Is this an altruistic decision to help your children? Or is this a pure investment decision? If it's pure investment, remove emotion, remove family. Because a lot of people say, oh, my kids might live in it one day. Well, buy, 3 houses and then you've made the capital growth. Just give them some equity and they can go buy whatever they want.
Or give them 3 sets of rent to rent a penthouse on the beach. Do you find I get a lot of clients that they're like, oh, I want to buy a house on the Sunshine Coast because I might use it as a holiday house, or I might move there in the future. And I'm just like, when's this plan? Oh, maybe 5 or 10 years.
Look, I say just buy the investment property and use booking.com to have a holiday and do it. That's why
I don't flexible.
That's why I don't buy a holiday house, right? Yeah. I often go up to Foster. I love going up to Boomerang Beach and Louise Beach, for example. Now, I can rent a house up there for a week for about $1,000 a week, and that's not even going to cover the council repayments for a quarter, right? So I much rather have the flexibility of going to different locations for my holidays than being tied to one particular holiday house that I may or may not use occasionally.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for people to be clear about their objectives and not mix, say, a holiday home with an investment property.
It's just emotions. It's nostalgia. So my dad had an apartment in Foster growing up. So I've been every single year for 5 weeks of my life. And I bought number 3 property in Foster because of that nostalgia. I wasn't using the numbers. I was just like, oh, this is cheap. It looks all right. This is back in the early days before I researched it. So there's always a nostalgia aspect to it.
So far, if you're purely going for commercial gains, get rid of the emotions.
Yeah.
look for the yield that will generate the best outcome for you. Try and avoid high density apartments. Don't go off the plan.
The comparison I use for this is if you're buying shares, you don't care where BHP has their headquarters. Like, oh, they're on the Sunshine Coast. It's beautiful there. I'm glad that all the workers are there. Like, you're looking at returns. Like, why would you have that aspect to it?
Exactly.
It's too much money as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Then the next part of it is we get down to the sort of the nitty gritty parts of doing investment. A lot of people like to buy investment properties in their own names because they want that depreciation and that negative gearing. So I guess the first question we ask, negative gearing in investment properties. Is that a good strategy? Is that not a great strategy? How do people maximize that?
Yeah, I think, again, this is, not giving financial or accounting advice. I think this is just general advice. I would say, yes, negative gearing is a great strategy for people on high incomes. I've used it myself and it's been brilliant. So if if a person's earning 400K or 500K a year, you're paying a lot of tax. How do you minimize that tax? You negative gear your properties. So you got to then buy properties purely that you know will have capital gain. There's no point negative gearing without getting capital gain. The whole point is it's going to offset the way in which you get that capital gain. So negative gearing is a great strategy and I'm still using it to this day. But your negative geared property, one day you want it to become positive cash flow.
Yes.
It's a bit like nurturing a baby, right? You got to feed it, it's going to grow up, and one day it might look after you, right? So I think negative gearing is a great strategy. On the flip side, positive cash flow is great. Like Steve, I'm also rebalancing my portfolio now as I get older toward more high yield properties, and particularly getting them into self-managed super fund where you can. So I guess it also comes down to the question of what name do you buy the property in? Do you buy it in a personal name or a trust or a company? Again, that's individualized tax advice that you need to get. The thing you got to be aware of though, when you do that is if you buy in a company or a trust, then you're not going to get the full tax-free threshold in each state. Each state has land tax that's levied at different numbers. So in New South Wales, I think it's 920,000 is the number now. So if you buy in a trust, then you have, I think it's a zero threshold. By a company, it's 50% of the threshold. So you've just got to know what is going to be the right way to buy, and whether you're going to, for asset protection, I've put some properties in trust and I've got some properties in personal name. So it just depends. Again, that comes down to an individual financial situation.
You always want a good accountant, like an accountant that you trust that kind of lays it out for you, because it's going to come down to tax minimization or asset protection. So like we're in jobs where we're dealing with lots of people's money. Asset protection's quite a large thing. Similar doctors as well.
Oh, well, we're less so because we have one of the best indemnity systems in the world. That protects us from going up.
And then one of the ones that people don't talk about is actually your finance, because sometimes you have got different lending options based on how you buy as well. So it's kind of amalgamating them two together. But what Rich actually said about the negative gearing argument, I actually agree with him, but I kind of think about it a little bit differently. I always look at, there's no point of talking about negative gearing unless you're getting a better return on investment. Because if I've got two properties and they grow exact same rate, and one's 10 grand a year positive and one's 30 grand a year negative, you're still in a better financial situation by buying the positively geared one. Typically what happens though in people on high incomes, like doctors and like us, is you can get a better quality asset, and that might mean, let's say the property is 30 grand a year negative and you're in 50% tax bracket, right? It's only 15 grand negative. So someone on 400, 500 grand a year, having a positively geared property 5 grand a year, it's not changing your lifestyle at all, but you're buying a slightly better quality property, a lower maintenance property, better quality tenants in a better location. You can kind of tick those boxes. So that 10, 15, 20 grand is actually worth it, because it actually gives you a headache-free property, more value add options, a better quality area. So I look at it more of like, okay, I want the best return on investment with as least hassle as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're going to negatively gear, you want that to eventually pay off something and be positively geared at one stage. And I think that's something a lot of people fall into the fallacy. Oh, I can negatively gear, I can save so much money on taxes. But like, what is the upside?
One of my pet peeves is when people say, oh, my positive is positively geared, and they're talking like 5 grand a year. And then there's someone saying, oh, I've got a negatively geared property and it's like 5 grand negative. And you're just kind of like, you're missing the point. Like we're looking big, we're trying to make millions of dollars here, not 5, 10 grand. Like it doesn't actually matter. But again, to your personal circumstances. When I started and I finished engineering and I was on 55 grand a year, I couldn't have multiple negatively geared properties. So everything I bought was positively geared. And then as my income kept going up, then I started buying negatively geared because I actually hold the assets.
And there's a lot of controversies on negative gearing right now, and the government talking about trying to tackle it again. I mean, look, Bill Shorten lost an election on that. Do you think it will never ever happen, or do you think it will? They will not get rid of it, but silo it within investment sort of assets rather than onto personal income?
I think it'll be a very brave government to take on and remove negative gearing. I think the problem is, the government's got a dilemma. We have a shortage of housing. So either the private sector provides investment housing or the government provides more social housing. Now, we know how terrible the government is in delivering social housing, and the speed at which they deliver is incredibly slow. So the government is just idiotic if they're going to remove negative gearing, because it's going to create more and more shortage of supply in property. So I think they're just going to leave negative gearing alone. They may tweak some of the depreciation allowances and claw back something like that. Sometime down the track, they may put limits on how many properties there are or something like that. But I really think it's going to be a brave government, and it'll be a suicidal political decision and also a bad economic decision to remove negative gearing. There's a really good argument, I think it was made by Peter Costello recently, about you can have negative gearing on shares. Like, why, if you're going to remove it for property, then you have to remove from all these other asset classes in which you can have negative gearing. So property is just one asset class.
So when I look back at, because you're an economist, when I look back at the whole negative gearing topic, negative gearing is actually not just one thing. It's like 3 or 4 different things, all bundled up into one sort of topic. In other countries, you are allowed to negative gear, but you're only allowed to deduct it against, say, non-income assets, such as other investment assets. Whereas in Australia, we actually are quite different, that we are allowed to sort of deduct it against our employment income assets. So, income. And so, do you think there's going to be like a slow sort of drift towards what the rest of the world does, or do you think they're just not going to touch it at all?
I don't think they'll touch it.
You don't think they're going to touch it at all?
Touch it.
Steve, what do you think?
I'm actually one of those blasé, ignorant people that only worry about the things that I can change. So I buy to the fundamentals. There's always something. There's always supply chain issues, pandemics, RBA changing rates. Then there's, the Royal Commission on lending. There's always something. But if you can't affect the outcome, why are you actually worried about it? You prepare for it. So people always talk about, interest rates are going to go up, they're going to go down, blah, blah. I'm just like, what are you worried about? You're holding this for 30 years. Look at the average, make sure you can handle the worst, reap the benefits when it's really low, and then kind of plan from there. So I actually try to avoid getting sucked into these arguments.
That's a really good point, because so many people use that as an excuse, I mean, I made a point on the last podcast I did a while ago, is to say that people procrastinate their decision because of all these externalities that may or may not happen. Why bother?
How many people did you see at the start of COVID that just fell off the cliff and was like, I'm not buying, I'm going to wait to see about COVID? I'm just like, are you buying only this for 1 year or 10 years? Or it's that mindset there. But I got a question I want to ask you, B, because I struggle with this a lot with doctors especially, because with their residential investing, they go for 5 years med school where they basically don't earn an income. Then they go to an internship for a couple of years, and they do their residency. Then they do their training, and their training, they'll slowly have a small linear progression of income. And then they finish and become specialized, and it's exponential.
Well, it depends.
Always exponential. Generally speaking, for certain
they can have the potential for exponential.
And it's especially when you know they're in a specialty where it might go up quite a lot.
It's like a sigmoid curve.
Yeah, it's one of those hard arguments you always have with people, because they just finished med school and they might only have a budget for like a $400,000 property, and you're always getting that conundrum of, do we wait a couple of years for your income to increase, or do we buy a slightly cheaper property now, and then knowing that they're going to finish, and then like the little townhouses and things like that in Foster I was talking about, like that's insignificant to me now, and that's why I've sold it. I actually just don't want the headache of having that property. But with a doctor, they can kind of at least project income based on their specialty. Do you find that's a struggle for some doctors?
Which part? The
planning, the investing of whether they bother starting small or they just hold on for a few years, knowing that, I don't know, if they're a surgeon, they're going to finish and their income so just skyrockets for the following few years.
That's a great question. If you asked me that question 10 years ago, I would say don't procrastinate, just get on with it, because there's a lot of certainty in the career progression scale from intern, resident, all the way to registrar and finishing. But right now, there's an absolute bottleneck in getting onto training programs, and even getting off training programs, and getting consultant jobs, and starting your private practice. So there's been multiple barriers that have been added into the system that just creates additional uncertainty, right? So for instance, in Victoria, you have to apply for a job every year, nearly, until you get to accredited training scheme, and then you have some certainty for maybe 4 to 5 years. Whereas in New South Wales, in the first 2 years, you're guaranteed a job. And then after that, it's anyone's wonder. It's all about being competitive. So there comes certain cutoff points where you're like, I don't know what I'm going to be doing next year. Can I afford this if I don't get the job I want, right? And so that has changed the metrics completely in the entire workforce. And to your point, at the end, when people finish their fellowship, they're again left with this scenario where do I get the next job? Do I get a public job? Do I get go into private practice, which could take X number of years to set up? So it's completely changed that metric. So people are being a bit more conservative because they don't know where they're going to be. And I think that's something that's very interesting, that's evolving in our sort of workforce. And again, New South Wales is one of the worst paying states for medical doctors and nurses. And that needs to change at some stage because it's becoming unaffordable to actually train in New South Wales. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that answers some of your questions.
The way I kind of pose it when I am talking to the doctors is I say, you buy when your finances allow and when you're educated. They're the two ones. And then based on the uncertainty is what your buffer is. So like if you're a police officer or a nurse and you've got your job, you need a smaller buffer because you know you're going to keep that job. Whereas the doctor's fluctuation of pay, you might actually have a larger buffer until you've actually earned that high income. And then that's the type of property that you buy. So I always just, there's no point waiting. Like I always find if you're going to wait 3 or 4 years, your circumstances change. People have kids, their partner like goes.
You could get partnered up, for instance.
A lot of doctors leave the industry. They kind of this been done and they go to a passion project.
Well, I think the other thing is too, Steve, if you've got that income capacity, I always say to any client, whether you're a doctor or any industry, is if you've got the borrowing capacity, use it because next year you don't know what your income is. You know, like, as a business owner, sometimes your income might be up or down. Every year your income's up, buy more property because the bank doesn't review the loan every 12 months, do they? Once you've got the loan, it's set and forget. The second thing I'd say is that if you can get them into the property early in the game, it also teaches them financial discipline. You know, it teaches them the art of holding a property, watching it ride through the cycles. And, you know, even if you bought an average property, hold it for 10 years and just enjoy the growth and leverage off that. Whereas if you delay, it's just going to put you further behind the equity train.
It actually removes the fear somewhat as well. If you start buying smaller properties, when you do get to a larger one, like I just bought a shopping centre, that fear's sort of gone because there's 9 other properties before that you're kind of ticking off. So it gets that. And then if you do make a mistake, it's not as big and you can recoup it later on.
I think it's just get into it. And if you make a mistake on the first or second one, so be it. That's a learning lesson because for most doctors, they can afford that mistake. And it's the fear of not getting into it.
That's it.
That really cripples people.
You will, if you do it alone, and this is where as buyer's agent, I know we're going to spruik this a little bit, but if you do it alone, like you will make mistakes. Like
absolutely, I've made mistakes.
I've done 2,000 deals, you do 4,500 deals, and I'm still learning every day. So after 2,000, I'm still learning. How are you going to know more than me after doing one deal? The issue is you can still go to a bad buyer's agent who kind of buys you a dud. So you have their mistakes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why we have both of you here. You've got the numbers to prove it. Yeah. All right. So before we finish, any sort of take-home messages?
There's no time like the present. I think number one is look at your finances, set some financial goals for yourself. I mean, obviously doctors are saying, okay, I want to train, I want to get to this progression in my career. Do the same with your finances. Do the same in your relationship. Like set some goals for yourself and take action to get it. Because I find, you know, if you don't take action on the goals, they're just a dream. But goals, when you have an action plan, becomes reality.
Yeah.
You know, so for me, it's around reviewing your finances. Literally every 90 days, you should be looking at your goals.
Really? Okay.
Every 90 days, you know. I mean, I try to do that with my team. Every 90 days, let's look at what the next steps are to get to help your clients to get to the next point. Let's every 90 days do that. So, and investing, be more unemotional about it. Get the advice. Don't get that disease called paralysis of analysis. My story was I was an economist in my past life, Steve, and my first property, I was so nervous about buying it. Honestly, I was so nervous. My wife and I.
My hand was shaking when I was
shaking. What am I doing? I'm spending $200,000 on a mortgage. How am I going to repay this? I'd have to. See, once you get used to handling debt, there's good debt, and debt can leverage you to a lot of wealth. You know, I don't really care about my debt. What I care about is my ability to service that debt and build my wealth from there. So there's no time like the present.
I was going to say that, but I'm going to flow on for that. Is the next step is actually just to get started. Actually do something. Like next year never comes. People always say, I'll worry about that next year. And when we're filming this, I know next year they'll go, next year. And then it'll be, I'll wait for the next year's tax return, and it pushes on. But one of the points I want to make, especially for doctors, is because they're masters of studying, they actually overanalyze everything. I just recently signed up a doctor and she's read my book 3 times before she made the call to me. And I'm just like, okay, you're missing the point here. So just learn the basics, and don't do anything stupid. If it's your first investment especially, just buy to the boring fundamentals.
Yeah.
The last 30 years, everything's quadrupled in value. So as long as you don't do something silly like buy in a flood zone or in a mining town or whatever it may be, you'll still be in a good spot and you can weather the storms.
Yeah, very sage advice. All right. So thank you both for joining us. And
pleasure.
Look forward to speaking to you again.
Great. Thanks, Bi.
Yeah, thank you. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The information and opinions shared are not intended as personal financial advice. The content presented should not be relied upon for making financial investment or other decisions. Listeners are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of qualified financial or legal professionals before making any financial decisions. While we aim to provide valuable and accurate information, we make no guarantees regarding the completeness or accuracy of the content. Any reliance on the information provided is done at your own risk.